Rosie, we are continuing today in Maseches Peah, Perek Gimel, Mishnayos Beis through Gimel. Mishnah Beis says as follows, Mishnah 2, Hamenamer es sadeu, b'shir kilochim lochim. An interesting case. Now, what we're talking about over here is as follows. A person is cutting down his wheat, he's harvesting his wheat, but not everything ripened at the same time. So what he's doing over here is he's cutting down the wheat that's ripe already, but he's leaving, menamer literally means spotting. But in this case, what it means is patches. He leaves patches of stalks that are not yet ready to be harvested. Rabbi Akiva says, no sin Peah mikol echad ve'echad. Rabbi Akiva says, because in this type of case, halacha lemaisa, he has to give a separate Peah from each and every one of the patches. Because the idea is, according to Rabbi Akiva, each patch is considered to be a separate field. The Chum say, me'echad al hakol. The Chacham, on the other hand, disagree, and the Chachamim hold that halacha lemaisa is looked at as one single field. So fundamental machlokes. Now remember, what's interesting in this case over here is just one type of produce. Rabbi Akiva says the fact that halacha lemaisa, they're clearly being harvested at separate times, generates an independent Peah obligation for each patch, whereas the Chacham see, we look at the field in its totality, and only one Peah is obligatory. Umodim Chachamim Rabbi Akiva. However, the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Akiva. Bizarea sheves o chardel b'shloshim makomos shunosein Peah mikol echad ve'echad. Chachamim agree with Rabbi Akiva in the following case: that if a person plants sheves is dill, or chardal is mustard seed, in literally again shlosha makomos, in three places, right? In three places in the field. Now, the Bartanura points out that 3 doesn't have to be 3. 3 could be 2 or 3. That in this case, you give Peah from each and every separate patch. Now, the logic behind here, the Bartanura says, meaning the way it works with apparently dill and mustard is, you never plant the full seed of dill or a full seed of mustard. The way you plant it is patches within a larger field. So because of that, the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Akiva in this kind of case, that halacha lemaisa, you would give Peah from each and every patch, because effectively each and every patch is considered to be its own field. Beautiful. Mishnah Gimel. Hamachalik bitzalim lochim loshuk umekayim yeveshim legorim. An interesting case. One who goes out and harvests onions. Machalik means you're right. You're pulling out onions. But these are lochim, moist onions. So his idea is he's pulling out the moist onions, he's going to sell them in the marketplace. Umekayim yeveshim lagoren. But ultimately, again, he keeps the dry onions in the ground, and his intention is, well, the reason he's keeping it in the ground is that halacha lemaisa, he doesn't yet plan on using them. He's going to put them in storage, right? He's going to put them in the oats, he's going to put them in storage, so he's leaving them in the ground right now. So here's an interesting case. Field is all of the same type of produce, but here he's harvesting for two reasons, right? On one hand, he's harvesting some of them for the purpose of selling them, and then he's selling others in order to go ahead and save them and store them. What's the halacha? Nosin Peah le'eliatzman le'eliatzman. Ultimately, he gives a separate Peah for each batch of onions. And the Bartanur says, the kishnei mine chitim damu, because this is like two different types of wheat. And remember, again, going back a couple of Mishnayos, when you have two different types of wheat, if they're harvested at the same time, so then there's one Peah. But if they're harvested at two times, then halacha lemaisa, there's two different Peahs. So in this type of case, this is like two different types of wheat, and because they're harvested at two different times, therefore halacha lemaisa, each one gets its own Peah. V'chein ba'apunin, v'chein bekerem. The same applies in apunin are chickpeas, and the same thing applies to a vineyard. Good. Hameidol. So this is an interesting case. Meidol, the Bartanur explains, is one pulls out onions, but for the sake of allowing the other onions in the ground to grow better. So I guess maybe I have too many onions growing in the field, so I'm going ahead and harvesting some of the onions to allow the other ones to grow properly. No saying min hamishur al mashashir. Ultimately, again, we go ahead and we give Peah from whatever's left. Literally, again. So the idea is he goes in and he gives Peah from literally what is left on what is growing. Now the idea is you don't have to give Peah. In other words, the stuff you pulled out of the ground in order to make room for the other onions to grow, is not considered to be something that has an obligation of Peah. Since you're not harvesting it to use it, but you're harvesting it to make room or to better allow for that which is in the ground to grow, therefore you only have to give Peah on that which is left in the ground itself. Hamachlik me'achas yad nosim min hamashur ala kol. That is an interesting one. But if he goes ahead, machlik me'achas yad means he goes ahead and he pulls out, right? Pulls out. Same case as the beginning of the Mishnah, which is he's pulling out some onions now, some onions later. But in the first case of the Mishnah, he was pulling out the onions for two different reasons. The first batch was being pulled out in order to sell. The second batch was being pulled out in order to store. So that's again where the Mishnah made the distinction that each one gets its own Peah. However, let's say same case. You're pulling out onions at two different times, but you're using them for the same purposes, meaning you're either going to sell all of the onions or you're going to store all of the onions, even though you're harvesting it at two different times. Halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah says there is only one Peah for the entire field. Wonderful. All right, Shkai Chavra, we'll stop over here. We'll continue tomorrow with Mishnah is Dalet and Hay in the third chapter. Have a wonderful day.